Most people do not survive the moment when their spiritual awakening truly begins. Not because the awakening destroys them, but because it quietly dismantles the life they learned to survive inside. We are often told that awakening arrives as peace, clarity, and relief, that when the soul turns toward truth, life immediately becomes lighter. But Ibn Arabi warned of something very different. He taught that truth does not arrive gently. It arrives like light in a sealed room, revealing everything that was hidden, everything that was avoided, everything that was held together by habit rather than honesty. And when that light touches the heart, nothing false can remain comfortable. This is why awakening does not begin with joy. It begins with discomfort, with restlessness that has no obvious cause, with a quiet dissatisfaction that seeps into ordinary moments. You wake up tired even after sleeping. Conversations feel strangely hollow, even with people you care about. The routines that once gave structure now feel heavy, almost foreign. You go through the motions of your life, yet something inside you feels absent, as if your soul has stepped slightly out of alignment with the world you're living in. You may still be functioning, still showing up, still meeting expectations, but inwardly something has shifted. And you can't explain it. You ask yourself questions you never asked before. Why does everything look fine, yet my heart feels unsettled? Why do the things that once motivated me feel empty now? Why does silence feel louder than noise? This is not weakness, and it is not ingratitude. Ibn Arabi taught that when the heart begins to awaken, it does not rise immediately, it first trembles. Because awakening does not add something new to you, it removes what no longer belongs. What makes this moment so difficult is that nothing is visibly wrong. There is no clear crisis, no dramatic collapse. From the outside, your life may look exactly the same, but inwardly, the structure you relied on has begun to loosen, and that loosening feels like danger to the self you built to survive. You see, for many people, identity is not truth, it is adaptation. We become who we needed to be accepted, to be safe, to be productive, to endure. That version of you worked. It kept you moving forward. It earned approval. It avoided pain. And because it worked, you trusted it. But Ibn Arabi reminds us that what helps us survive is not always what helps us awaken. So when awakening begins, it does not announce itself with certainty. It arrives as confusion, as a subtle loss of orientation, as the sense that the life you are living no longer fits the depth you are beginning to feel inside. The ego experiences this as threat. It tells you something is wrong. It urges you to distract yourself, to stay busy, to return to what feels familiar. Because familiarity feels safer than truth. This is the moment where many people turn back. They interpret the discomfort as failure. They assume something has gone wrong. And so they retreat, back into noise, back into routine, back into identities that feel solid even if they feel hollow. But Ibn Arabi taught that the soul does not awaken to comfort the self. It awakens to free it. If you are here, if you recognize this quiet unease, this subtle dissonance, you are not broken. You are not lost. You are standing at the edge of something real. The awakening hasn't destroyed your life. It has simply begun to reveal what cannot come with you any further. And this is only the beginning. To understand why so many people retreat when awakening begins, you first have to understand what is being threatened. It is not your soul. It is not your faith. It is the self you learn to become in order to survive. Most people move through life wearing an identity they mistake for their essence, not because they are dishonest, but because this identity once protected them. It was shaped quietly over years by family expectations, social roles, fear of rejection, the need to be useful, productive, admired, or simply left alone. And because this version of you worked, you trusted it. You built your life around it. You defended it. You called it me. But Ibn Arabi taught that what we call the self is often only a structure, an arrangement of habits, responses, and roles that formed around fear rather than truth. He did not speak of the ego as an enemy to be destroyed, but as something temporary, something that appears when the heart forgets its center. This is why awakening feels like collapse, because what begins to dissolve is not imaginary. It is the very framework that held your life together. Think about how often identity is reinforced through function. You are the dependable one, the quiet one, the strong one, the one who keeps going, the one who doesn't need much. These roles may have been necessary once. They may have helped you endure environments where it wasn't safe to be fully seen. But over time, survival hardens into identity, and identity becomes a prison when it is no longer questioned. When awakening begins, this false solidity starts to crack. You may notice it in small, unsettling ways. The role you've always played feels heavy. The praise that once motivated you feels empty. The expectations you once carried without complaint now feel suffocating. You begin to feel tired in a way that rest does not fix. This is not physical exhaustion. It is the exhaustion of living from a place that is no longer true. Ibn Arabi described this stage as the beginning of fana, the dissolving of the false self, not the death of the body and not madness, but the slow unraveling of the illusion that this constructed identity was ever the real you. And this is where fear intensifies. Because as the structure weakens, the mind panics. It tells you that you are losing yourself, that you are becoming unstable, that something is wrong. But what is actually happening is far more subtle and far more profound. You are not losing your mind. You are losing the story your mind depended on to feel in control. This is why so many people mistake awakening for crisis. The self that was built around certainty cannot survive uncertainty. The self that was built around approval cannot survive honesty. The self that was built around control cannot survive surrender. So when these foundations begin to erode, the experience feels like free fall. Yet Ibn Arabi reminds us that something does not dissolve unless it was never solid to begin with. What is being stripped away now is not your essence. It is the mask that learned how to function in a world that did not always make room for your truth. And masks do not fall gently. They cling. They resist. They convince you that without them, you will disappear. This is the great misunderstanding at the heart of awakening. The fear is not that you will lose yourself. The fear is that without this identity, you will have nothing to stand on. And so many turn back at this point, not because they are weak, but because the ground beneath them feels unfamiliar. But Ibn Arabi taught that when the false self begins to fall apart, it is not abandonment, it is preparation. The collapse is not meant to destroy you, it is meant to make space. Because once the identity built on fear loosens its grip, something else begins to stir, something quieter, something older, a presence that does not need performance to exist. And that is when the soul begins to speak. When the soul begins to speak, it does not do so in clear sentences. It speaks through disturbance, through misalignment, through a quiet inner contradiction that makes life feel unfamiliar, even when nothing on the surface has changed. This is often the stage where people become afraid, not because something dramatic has happened, but because meaning itself begins to wobble. The things that once felt obvious no longer do. The direction you were moving in suddenly feels uncertain. You may find yourself questioning choices that once felt right, not with panic, but with a slow, unsettling doubt. Why am I doing this? Why does this life feel like it belongs to someone else? Why do I feel distant from things I once cared about? These questions do not arrive all at once. They slip in quietly, often during ordinary moments, while driving, while lying awake at night, while standing in a room full of people and feeling strangely alone. You may still love the people around you, yet feel disconnected from them. Not because you have become cold, but because something within you is turning inward. Ibn Arabi taught that the soul does not ascend first. It descends. Awakening is not an immediate rise into clarity, it is a descent into truth. And descent always feels like loss to the mind that equates growth with elevation. This is why life begins to feel confusing at this stage. The soul is drawing your attention away from external alignment, status, approval, accomplishment, and toward inner coherence. But the mind resists this shift. It wants explanations. It wants timelines. It wants to know where this is going. The soul offers none of that. Instead, it disrupts. It makes you uncomfortable in places that once felt safe. It weakens attachments that once felt necessary. It removes the emotional reward from things you pursued out of habit rather than meaning. This is not punishment. It is recalibration. You may notice it in how success feels different now. Achievements land without satisfaction. Praise feels thin. Even spiritual practices may feel heavier, prayer quieter, less emotional, more honest. You are not regressing. You are being stripped of illusion. And this is deeply unsettling. Because the world rewards certainty. It rewards clarity, confidence, direction. But Ibn Arabi reminds us that certainty belongs to the ego, not the soul. The soul lives in truth, and truth is not always comfortable. It does not always explain itself. Sometimes it simply withdraws its energy from what is no longer aligned. This is why many people interpret this phase as loss of motivation, depression, or confusion. And while those labels may describe the surface, they miss the deeper movement underneath. Something within you has outgrown the life you are living. And growth, when it happens internally first, feels like disorientation. You may feel guilty for this. You may think, I should be grateful. Nothing is wrong. But Ibn Arabi taught that ingratitude is not noticing discomfort, it is ignoring it. The soul speaks through unease because ease would keep you asleep. This is also the stage where loneliness becomes pronounced. You may feel misunderstood, even by those closest to you. Conversations that once flowed now feel shallow. You listen, you respond, but something inside you remains quiet, detached, as if observing from a distance. This does not mean you are meant to leave everyone behind. It means your inner compass is being recalibrated. The soul is pulling you inward, away from borrowed meanings and toward something essential. And this inward pull feels frightening because it removes distraction. You are no longer as easily comforted by noise, activity, or explanation. Silence begins to stretch. Stillness becomes uncomfortable. You are left alone with yourself in a way you may never have been before. Ibn Arabi taught that before the heart can be filled with truth, it must first be emptied. And emptiness feels like loss when you are used to being full of roles, plans, and identities. So if life feels confusing right now, if direction feels unclear, if the world feels loud but your soul feels silent, this is not failure. It is not regression. It is the sound of the soul reclaiming space. And this confusion has a purpose. Because what comes next is not clarity, but confrontation. When the soul begins to reclaim space, it does not do so gently. It begins by loosening what was buried. This is often the moment when pain surfaces in ways that feel sudden and uninvited. Old grief rises without a clear reason. Emotions appear that you thought you had already resolved. You may find yourself feeling sadness on ordinary days, or a quiet heaviness that lingers in your chest even when nothing specific has happened. Tears may come without a story. Fatigue may settle in without physical cause. This is where many people become frightened. Because we are taught to interpret pain as failure, to believe that if something hurts, something has gone wrong. And so when awakening brings discomfort instead of relief, the instinct is to escape it, to drown it out with distraction, to stay busy, to explain it away, or to spiritualize it into something distant and abstract. But Ibn Arabi taught something that runs directly against this instinct. He taught that pain is not the enemy of awakening. Avoidance is. Pain in this stage is not trying to harm you. It is trying to reveal you. For years, perhaps decades, Parts of your inner life were sealed away for protection, not healing. Feelings that could not be expressed were stored. Losses that were never fully grieved were carried forward in silence. Fears that once kept you safe were never questioned, only obeyed. And because life demanded that you function, you learned how to move on without looking back. Awakening interrupts this arrangement. It removes the distractions that once kept these inner rooms closed. And when those doors open, what emerges can feel overwhelming, not because it is too much, but because it has been waiting too long. Ibn Arabi spoke of the heart as a place crowded with veils, not because Allah is hidden, but because the heart becomes full of unexamined attachments, unacknowledged wounds, and borrowed identities. When those veils begin to lift, the heart trembles, not from punishment, but from recognition. This trembling is often mistaken for breakdown. You may feel sadness without knowing why. A quiet grief may sit with you for days. Old memories may surface unexpectedly. You may feel more sensitive, more exposed, less able to tolerate superficial interactions. And the mind, desperate to regain control, may tell you that something is wrong with you. But Ibn Arabi reminds us that what is surfacing now is not new. It is what was always there, waiting for the moment when you were strong enough to stop running. The Sufis say that the soul weeps not because it is wounded, but because it remembers its origin. And remembrance hurts when you have been far from home. This is why avoidance delays awakening. Not because pain is too much to bear, but because running from it keeps the heart divided. Pain, when met with presence, becomes a doorway. It reveals where truth has been buried beneath fear. When grief rises, it is not asking to be silenced. It is asking to be witnessed. When fear surfaces, it is not trying to destroy you. It is asking to be understood. And when you sit with these feelings, without judgment, without rushing to fix them, without turning away, something subtle begins to happen. The heart softens, not weakens, softens. In that softness, mercy begins to flow, not only toward others, but toward yourself. You begin to see your own life with gentler eyes. You feel compassion for the child who learned to stay quiet to feel safe, for the youth who learned to perform to be accepted, for the adult who carried responsibilities that were too heavy for one's soul. This compassion is not self-pity, it is remembrance. It is the soul finally saying, "I see you now." And this is where transformation truly begins, not through effort, not through control, but through presence, through staying with what is real instead of fleeing toward what is comfortable. This is the doorway most people refuse to enter, because it requires stillness, it requires honesty, and it requires letting pain speak without immediately trying to silence it. But for those who stay, something begins to loosen. And once the heart learns that it can hold truth without breaking, it is ready for the next stage. The space between what has fallen away and what has not yet formed. After the pain has been acknowledged, after the heart has softened enough to stop resisting itself, a strange stillness often follows. Not peace in the way it is usually described, but suspension. A sense that life has slowed, even if the days continue as usual. This is the place Ibn Arabi described as barzakh, the in-between. It is a state where the old self no longer fits, yet nothing new has fully arrived. You wake up and move through your routines, but they feel strangely hollow. The identities you once relied on no longer hold you, yet you don't know what will replace them. Direction feels blurred. Motivation comes and goes. You may find yourself saying, "I don't know anymore," more often than you ever have before. And that uncertainty can feel frightening. Because the world does not know what to do with someone who is between definitions. Family may ask what's wrong. Friends may sense a distance they can't explain. Even you may wonder why you feel unanchored, why the clarity you once had has dissolved. But Ibn Arabi taught that barzakh is not confusion, it is transition. In this space, nothing is demanded of you except honesty, not strength, not certainty, not answers, just truth. And truth in this stage often sounds like I don't know who I am right now. That admission alone can feel like failure, but it is actually a deep form of integrity. This is also the stage where many people feel pressure to perform healing, to appear okay, to present themselves as spiritually advanced, composed, resolved. But Barzak does not allow performance. It strips away the need to explain yourself. It removes the urgency to label what is happening. You stop pretending that you have arrived. And in that stopping, something inside you exhales. Ibn Arabi understood this space as sacred, a pause between breaths, a womb rather than a void. Nothing grows here because nothing is meant to grow yet. This is not the time for becoming. It is the time for allowing what is false to finish falling away. Life may feel quiet in this phase, conversations shorter, desires fewer. You may spend more time alone, not out of rejection, but because the noise of constant interaction no longer soothes you. Silence becomes both uncomfortable and necessary. This is where many misinterpret what is happening. They think they are losing interest in life. But what is actually happening is that life is no longer being filtered through borrowed meanings. You are no longer chasing the next role, the next goal, the next version of yourself. And without those pursuits, the emptiness becomes visible. But Ibn Arabi reminds us that emptiness is not absence. It is space, space for something truer to settle. In Barzak, the heart learns to rest without distraction, to be present without purpose, to exist without performance. This is deeply unsettling for the ego, which thrives on movement and explanation. But for the soul, this stillness is nourishment. You may notice that you stop forcing decisions, stop rushing conclusions, stop demanding clarity from experiences that have not finished speaking. You begin to listen rather than push. This listening is subtle. It is not dramatic. It does not arrive with visions or certainty. It shows up as a quiet honesty with yourself, as the willingness to say, I don't know yet, and that is okay. And it is here in this in-between that something essential begins to happen. As certainty dissolves, the heart widens. As labels fall away, presence deepens. This is not an ending, and it is not a failure. It is the threshold. Because when the heart can remain open in uncertainty without rushing back to comfort, it becomes ready for the next unveiling. The moment when knowing falls away completely, and something deeper takes its place. When the heart learns to remain open in the in-between, something subtle yet profound begins to unfold. What follows is not clarity, not direction, and not the return of certainty, but its complete undoing. Ibn Arabi called this state hera, sacred bewilderment. At first, this bewilderment feels unsettling, even alarming. The mind has always relied on knowing where it stands, on understanding who it is and where it is going. Certainty has been its anchor. So when that anchor loosens, the mind panics. It searches for answers, definitions, reassurance, anything that will restore the familiar sense of control. But the soul does not panic. The soul recognizes this space. In Hera, you may feel as though you are standing in a wide desert with no landmarks. Nothing clearly guides you forward, yet nothing pulls you backward either. You wake up feeling both ancient and newborn. Your old identity no longer fits, but you have not yet found language for what is emerging. Words feel insufficient. Plans feel forced. Even prayer may feel different, quieter, heavier, stripped of expectation. This is not a loss of faith. It is the loss of illusion. Ibn Arabi taught that before divine knowledge can settle in the heart, the self must be emptied of its certainties, because Allah does not enter where the ego insists on ruling. As long as the mind demands guarantees, the heart remains narrow. Hera widens it. This is why this stage does not feel holy. It feels empty, but not empty like absence, empty like openness, like a sky without clouds, like a vessel cleared of noise so that something real may be received. The ego struggles here because it has no role. It cannot perform, cannot prove, cannot explain. And so it whispers that you are lost, that you are drifting, that something has gone wrong. But Ibn Arabi offers a different perspective. He said that there comes a moment when the seeker no longer knows where they are going, and that is not loss, it is arrival. Because when certainty falls away, the heart becomes capable of listening. In this space, you stop asking, "What should I become?" and begin asking, "What is being revealed through me?" This shift is subtle, but it changes everything. You no longer force purpose. You no longer chase meaning. You stop demanding clarity from experiences that are meant to teach through presence rather than explanation. Life begins to speak in quieter ways. You start to notice when something pulls you away from yourself, not morally, but spiritually. You feel misalignment in your body before you can name it in your mind. You sense when words ring hollow, when actions feel forced, when choices are driven by fear rather than truth. This is not intuition as a skill, it is awareness as a state. And it requires humility, because in Hera you cannot claim understanding. You can only remain attentive. You walk more slowly through life. You listen more than you speak. You become comfortable saying, "I don't know." This humility is not weakness. It is the soil of wisdom. Ibn Arabi taught that knowledge does not arrive where certainty dominates. It arrives where the heart is wide enough to hold paradox, ambiguity, and not knowing. And so in this bewilderment, something essential is being prepared. You are not being asked to abandon reason. You are being asked to loosen its grip. Because the mind wants structure. The ego wants certainty. But the soul wants truth, even if truth arrives without form. And so this stage feels like being unmade, like standing without ground beneath you, like losing yourself. But what you are losing is not your essence. You are losing the stories you used to survive. And when those stories fall away, something else becomes possible, something quieter, something deeper. A recognition that does not need words. A knowing that does not demand proof. And this is where the journey begins to turn, not toward escape from the world, but toward a more intimate way of being within it. Because when the heart is emptied of certainty, it becomes capable of recognition. And recognition is what comes next. After bewilderment has done its quiet work, after certainty has loosened its hold, something begins to settle, not as an idea, not as a conclusion, but as a recognition. It does not arrive dramatically. It does not announce itself. It simply becomes obvious in the way breath becomes obvious when you finally stop holding it. Ibn Arabi called this wujud, being itself recognizing itself. This recognition does not feel like gaining something new. It feels like remembering something that was never truly lost. You begin to sense, not intellectually but inwardly, that the separation you once felt from yourself, from others, from Allah, was not real. It was the result of distraction, of living outward rather than inward, of mistaking roles for reality. In this state, compassion begins to flow without effort. Judgment feels heavy, almost unnatural. You notice that reacting harshly now costs more than it once did, not because you are trying to be better, but because misalignment has become uncomfortable. You begin to recognize others not as obstacles or comparisons, but as mirrors, each reflecting a different face of the same divine reality. This does not mean you withdraw from the world. On the contrary, you begin to engage with it more honestly. You listen more carefully. You speak more deliberately. You act less out of habit and more out of presence. Ibn Arabi taught that the perfected human is not one who escapes the world, but one who carries the real within it. And this is where that teaching becomes lived rather than understood. Your breath becomes a form of prayer, not because you label it as such, but because it carries awareness. Your listening becomes worship because it is no longer about response but about presence. Even silence takes on a different quality. It is no longer empty, it is attentive. You may notice that you no longer feel the same urge to explain yourself, The need to be understood softens. The desire to defend your path fades. This is not indifference. It is alignment. Understanding, you realize, does not come from explanation. It comes from resonance. Some people will feel comfortable in your presence without knowing why. Others may feel unsettled, not because you are doing anything, but because presence has a way of revealing what noise conceals. This is not something to control or manage. It is simply a consequence of being rooted rather than reactive. Ibn Arabi said something both unsettling and freeing. Whoever truly knows himself becomes unknown to the world. When identity no longer depends on reflection, the world loses its power to define you. You stop chasing belonging. You become a place of belonging. In this recognition, life begins to feel less like a problem to solve and more like something to be listened to. You stop forcing purpose. You stop chasing meaning. Instead, meaning reveals itself in the way you respond to what is in front of you. This is not certainty, and it is not conclusion, it is intimacy. An intimacy with life as it is, not as you wish it to be. An intimacy with yourself that does not require performance. An intimacy with Allah that does not depend on distance. You begin to sense that nothing needs to be added, that you are not lacking something essential, that the striving which once drove you was born from forgetting rather than need. And slowly, something else dissolves. The need to prove your worth. The need to convince others of your truth. The need to constantly become something else. What remains is presence. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady. And this presence changes how you walk through the world. You still experience pain, but it no longer defines you. You still encounter loss, but it no longer destroys you. There is a quiet strength growing now, not the strength of dominance or control, but the rooted strength of surrender. You are not above life, you are within it. And because of that, life begins to meet you differently. This recognition is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of integration. The moment when awakening stops being something you experience internally and begins to shape how you live outwardly. And that return to the world you never left is where the real test begins. When awakening reaches this stage, it no longer announces itself. It becomes quiet, ordinary, almost invisible. You wake up, go about your day, speak with people, fulfill responsibilities. On the surface, very little has changed. Yet something within you remains anchored, a stillness that does not depend on circumstances, a presence that does not need to be defended. Ibn Arabi described this as the return without leaving, the realization that you never needed to escape the world to find truth. You were never meant to withdraw from life, but to enter it fully, without being owned by it. This is where many misunderstand awakening. They expect transformation to look dramatic. They expect clarity, confidence, and visible difference. But what emerges instead is subtle alignment. You move more gently. You speak more carefully. You listen without rushing to respond. You still feel pain. You still encounter loss. But these experiences no longer define you. They pass through a deeper center that remains intact. People may respond to you differently now. Some will feel unsettled in your presence without knowing why. Others will feel seen, held, understood, even if you say very little. This is not because you are special. It is because presence communicates without words. Ibn Arabi taught that the human being is meant to be a mirror, not reflecting the ego, but reflecting the real with mercy. And when presence replaces performance, that reflection becomes natural. You no longer chase awakening. You no longer seek constant transformation. Life itself becomes the teacher. What once hurt now instructs. What once frightened now guides. What once broke you now bows, not because you conquered it, but because you listened. There is a quiet strength in this stage, not the loud strength of certainty or dominance, but the rooted strength of surrender. You no longer need to prove your worth. You no longer need to convince the world of your truth. Something inside you has settled. You may lose people, you may lose identities, you may lose paths you once followed, but what you gain is alignment, a stillness that holds you when the world shakes, a knowing that does not shout yet never lies. This is not perfection, it is presence. You begin to walk through the world without armor, to live among noise without losing your center, to touch life without grasping it. This is not withdrawal, it is participation without attachment. Ibn Arabi taught that the servant does not reach Allah by rising upward, but by falling inward, until nothing remains except what is real. And what remains now is not an ideal self, not a purified image, but your full humanity held in awareness. The broken parts, the healed parts, the parts still learning how to breathe again. All of them are allowed to exist together. This is why you survived what almost shattered you, not because you were strong, not because you understood, but because you stayed. You stayed when prayer felt empty. You stayed when silence felt heavier than noise. You stayed when the self you once trusted collapsed in your hands. And in that staying, something subtle happened. You were not rebuilt. You were revealed. You now carry something quiet into the world, not knowledge, not authority, but presence, a stillness that teaches without instruction, a depth that does not seek attention. You no longer run toward God. You begin to recognize that God was always closer than your breath. And this recognition changes everything, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. This is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of living what you have already become. And now, the question is no longer whether awakening will survive you. The question is whether you are willing to carry it, gently, honestly, and fully, into the life you are already living.